Fixing the Past. A story about rediscovery. John was now in an empty house and stood in the living room. She said that she needed space and left without saying another word. He knew that it was for the better. It was kind of a relief as he took in the emptiness of the house. The leaves were changing color and starting to wilt outside, and John just looked out into the distance. His mind was blank, numb actually. His whole body felt numb, right down to his soul, and he couldn't move. He didn't want to move. Standing there looking out the window felt peaceful, and he didn't need to be something he wasn't or change something about himself to fit into a concept of someone else. John was a broken man. More than an hour had passed before he realized that he was standing there, doing nothing. Coffee came to mind as he moved to the kitchen, his safe space. The whiskey was winking at him from the glass cabinet, and an idea crossed his mind to add it to the coffee. His great-grandfather was Irish anyway. He was pouring the whiskey in free-handed before he realized what he was doing. It was okay. Everything was going to be okay. Charlotte had grown more distant over the past few weeks and always seemed to have on earphones in, listening to rock music whenever he was around. He'd told her before that they could get through anything, as long as they talk about it. She would nod and turn away, carry on whatever she was doing and not talk. Until one day he said it again and she finally burst into tears. "I just don't know if I want to be in this relationship," she sniffled and wiped her tears. "I figured that something was bothering you and I wanted to give you your space." "Can we talk about how we got here?" he asked, trying to hold his composure while his stomach dropped. "I don't know. I just don't know," she continued. Charlotte never elaborated on what drove her to feel this way. He'd been calm even when he was boiling with anger, and perhaps he was too delicate. John had never thought of himself as a beta male, but maybe, somewhere down the line, he'd become one. Now he sat in his kitchen watching the sunset, having a coffee, a third of the cup filled with whiskey. John used to paint. He used to read a lot. He also used to go out a lot more. After moving in with Charlotte, his brushes hardened, his bookshelf became dusty, and she became his main focus of interest. There was no balance, and it took him being alone in the house to see that. John knew that she may never come back. He'd never hear her voice again or smell her hair and perfume. He could still smell it in the rooms, but he knew it would fade, and so would the pain. Hopefully. It was nighttime and his thoughts dwelled on everything he'd said or done, analyzing his actions, trying to reconstruct his mistakes. But there was no fixing the past. The damage was done and there was no way to go back and make it right. And even if he could, John wasn't sure what exactly he could do or say to make it right. After running the image of her walking out in his head on a loop for hours, John finally saw the stars in the sky. They were so beautiful, and he tried to remember when last he'd actually looked at them, and just looked. A feeling of relief washed over him and a tear escaped the corner of his eye. The emotions that were bottled up had finally found a crack in his armor to escape, and he sat there looking out of his kitchen window. Years of not allowing himself to break came crashing through in a single wave, and he wept. After regaining his composure and washing his face, John got some coffee without the whiskey and wandered around the house. Without thought he found himself in a room which he hadn't gone into for months unless he needed something. The painting room and library, where he actually found Charlotte sitting and reading on the couch in there one time, was a room he'd just simply neglected. John took a few steps into the room and stopped, scanning the contents. A large blank canvas stood against the back wall and caught his eye. Its large white, empty surface was like the void he needed to fill in his life, and slowly, he began to see it. A picture took form in his mind's eye, and placing the coffee on the table next to him, John took a deep breath and picked up the paintbrush next to the canvas. 1 year later. The leaves had begun to wilt earlier this year as John met his guests. His agent had been buzzing around the room and making sure everyone attending the exhibit had a fresh drink and admiring the art. He'd been painting non-stop for months, and word had gotten around town after a friend had taken a picture of one of his works and someone who knew art saw it. The agency jumped at the opportunity at exhibiting this unknown artist who actually had a day job but created marvelous works of art. They threw in a complete makeover, getting him a haircut, expert shave, and a new wardrobe for the event, and many more to come. Greeting the patrons and making small talk, he joked and laughed, moving around the room and explaining what he was feeling and what inspired the art. One in particular caught the eye of many. It was a vibrant picture of death and rebirth, an end and a beginning. It was a painting of a woman walking out of a door. The colors illustrated that the outside was dark and grey, while the inside of the house was filled with a mixture of vibrant colors that almost resembled a rainbow. The message was so clear that even a non-art lover could tell what this meant, and yet, the way it was drawn is what got the art guru's attention. His brushwork and use of color was immaculate, and some felt the price severely undervalued. John simply smiled and looked at his work, examining all the strokes and angles, and others shook his hand as they praised the work. "Well done is what I think I should say," a voice spoke behind him to get his attention. It was Charlotte, wearing a tight-fitting red cocktail dress with a plunging neckline and black Jimmy Choo high-heel pumps. Her hair was done immaculately and her lipstick matched her dress. She stood in front of him with her purse in both hands and glanced between him and the art piece, clearly recognizing the moment and what it meant. He paused for a long moment before he spoke and looked back at the piece, saying, "It was the first of the collection. I painted it the night you left." She dropped her head slightly and said softly, "I see." They stood next to each other looking at it, and a charismatic guru brought his date to look at it to explain the work. John and Charlotte were far enough away for them to enjoy the piece, but close enough to hear what was said. The art guru held his champagne in one hand and used his free hand to explain, "You see, she's walking out into the cold, dark world, filled with the grey uncertainty of the outside life. And though she may be okay with what happens next, and who knows, she may even flourish out there, the viewer sees the interior world now." Suddenly, his free hand waving over the colorful side of the piece, with her gone, the viewer's world brightens up, flooding it with possibility and wonder. The girl next to him stood with her mouth agape, and he went on to say some more things. However, both John and Charlotte had stopped listening. Charlotte shifted slightly in her heels and turned to face him, then turned away. "You painted this the night I left, you said?" she asked. "Millimeter," he responded, not looking in her direction. "So, this isn't something you did after you were already becoming a recognized artist. You did this when no one knew who you were," she continued, sounding like she was reasoning out loud. John turned to her, focusing his gaze. She was radiantly beautiful to look at, but his heart saw something else in her. Letting out a small gasp, she continued, "You weren't predicting the future. You were painting your world without me in it." John did not respond, choosing to use silence as an answer. The room, though vibrant, grew quiet for the two of them as their eyes met. She could see that the man she'd left was gone. He could see that she'd seemingly found what it was she was looking for. However, this painting affected her. He looked back at the painting as he chose to respond after a long moment. "I had played that moment out in my head so many times that I didn't think of anything else," he said, sliding his hands in his pockets. "Then I went into the drawing room/library, you remember?" She nodded slightly, showing that she was paying attention, wanting to know what he was thinking. "I stood there, looking at this empty canvas, and the silence was deafening." His brow furrowed as he explained, then he sighed and his expression softened. "But looking at it for so long, and that scene playing out over and over and over in my head, it started to form a picture that I could see, as clear as it is now." He removed one hand from his pocket and motioned it over the painting from one end to the other. "I painted what I saw, and this is the result. That's it," he ended, and looked back at her. Charlotte's hair fell slightly as she looked back and forth and to her shoes. "I know that it's too little too late, but for what it's worth, I could have ended things better than I did," she said, raising her head to look him in the eye. "I know you had your reasons." And I don't blame you, he responded, putting one hand on his hip and the other waved to the art. I could always do this. But I lost sight of me. And in doing so, I lost you. She tilted her head slightly and he put that hand on his chest as if clutching his heart. I wanted nothing else in this world but you. At one point, he fought back the emotion that he'd once bottled up so well. I know that making you my world wasn't good for either of us and you deserved better. He ended off looking at the rest of the room to stabilize himself. Charlotte fixed her hair and dress, clearing her throat, turning to the piece once again. She stepped closer to him and softly tugged at his pinky finger, her voice just loud enough for him to hear. I'm sorry. He exhaled heavily and replied, so am I. If you've enjoyed this short story and you'd like to support many more to come, caffeine keeps me going, so if you'd like to buy me a coffee, using the link in the description, I'd really appreciate it.